There is no sound quite as distinct as a family group chat blowing up when they smell blood in the water. For 3 years, I had kept my distance, building an empire in silence, while my mother and brother waited for me to fail. Yesterday, they thought their moment had finally arrived. My phone lit up with a notification from my mother. The bank finally took it. Foreclosure. I'm buying it at auction for pennies on the dollar. I watched in real time as my brother wired her his life savings, eager to swoop in and claim the home I had built. They were popping champagne, planning the renovations, and laughing at my financial ruin. They didn't know I was sitting in that very living room holding a receipt that would destroy them. 10 minutes later, the bank vice president didn't just call my mother, he unwittingly delivered the final blow. When he dropped the bombshell that the property wasn't in foreclosure, but that the $1.2 million mortgage had just been paid in full in cash, the silence on the other end was louder than a scream. But the best part wasn't the money. It was the realization of who signed the check. Buckle up. This isn't just a story about a beach house. It's a masterclass in silent success and the brutal legal dismantling of a toxic family. If you want to see a narcissist's reality crumble in a single phone call, you need to hear this story. The fallout is absolutely delicious. My name is Alara Vance, a 32-year-old forensic accountant who spent the last 5 years building a reputation as the financial Grim Reaper for Fortune 500 companies in New York City. To the world of high finance, I am a ruthless auditor who dismantles corporate fraud with surgical precision, but to the people waiting for me behind the iron gates of my childhood home, I am nothing more than a failed artist who couldn't cut it in the real world. As I steered my modest rental car up the winding driveway of the Sterling estate, I took a deep breath, mentally shedding my sharp business persona and slipping into the skin of the fragile, defeated daughter they expected to see. The transition from the calculated victory of the beach house incident to physically stepping back onto the estate grounds felt surreal, like walking into a lion's den wearing a meat suit. The last time I saw this house, I was running away from the suffocating control of my stepmother Lydia and her golden boy son, Julian. They stood on the porch now, waiting for me like vultures sensing a dying animal. Lydia was draped in dramatic black silk, a performance of grief for my father's memorial that didn't quite reach her cold, calculating eyes. As I stepped out of the car, she didn't offer a hug but rather a pitying tilt of her head. "Oh, Elara," she sighed, her voice dripping with condescension. "Look at you. You look worn." "I told you city life would chew you up without family money to cushion the blow." I forced my shoulders to slump and lowered my gaze, playing the part perfectly. "It's been hard, Lydia," I murmured, suppressing the urge to laugh. If only she knew that my worn look was actually the result of closing a $10 million merger deal just 48 hours ago. We moved inside and immediately my auditor's instinct kicked in. The grand foyer, once the jewel of my father's success, whispered secrets of financial ruin. The fresh lilies that used to fill the vases daily were replaced by high-quality silk imposters, likely to save on florist bills. I noticed a distinct square of unfaded wallpaper in the hallway where a sprawling landscape painting by a renowned French artist used to hang. They were selling off the assets. The house wasn't just quiet, it was starving. Later that evening, over a dinner that was noticeably less extravagant than the banquets of my childhood, I decided to test the waters. I pushed my food around the plate and looked up at Julian with wide, innocent eyes. "Is the company going to be okay without Dad?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. I remember he was worried about the debt ratios before I left. Julian scoffed, exchanging an amused glance with his mother. He took a long sip of wine, his arrogance making him careless. "Debt ratios, Elara, please. You wouldn't understand the complexities of modern leverage," he mansplained, leaning back in his chair. "We're moving money around. It's called creative liquidity. The books show what we want them to show until the merger goes through. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from fear, but from the thrill of confirmation. Creative liquidity. In my line of work, that was just a fancy term for cooking the books. He had just admitted they were hiding losses likely to inflate the company's value artificially before selling it off. I nodded vacantly, pretending his explanation went over my head, but mentally I was already filing away the date and time of his confession. The hammer dropped after dessert. Lydia invited me into my father's study, the air heavy with the scent of old leather and stale cigar smoke. "We need to handle some boring paperwork before the memorial," she said, sliding a thick stack of documents across the mahogany desk. "It's just a standard formality to update the estate transfer since your father passed. Just sign at the tabs, dear. We don't want to bore you with the legal jargon." She held out a gold pen, her smile tight and predatory. I reached for the pen, my hand shaking intentionally, and glanced at the page. It was dense, deliberately obfuscated by complex clauses, but my eyes locked onto a paragraph near the bottom. "The undersigned hereby waives all claims to the Vance Family Trust and grants full power of attorney to the executor." It wasn't an update. It was a complete abdication of my inheritance. They weren't just trying to hide the company's failure, they were trying to strip me of my personal assets to plug their own leaking ship before the whole thing went under. I dropped the pen, pressing my hand to my forehead. I can't," I stammered, breathing heavily. "I'm so tired from the drive, Lydia. The words are swimming. Can I just sleep on it? I'll sign it first thing in the morning." Lydia's eyes narrowed, a flash of irritation breaking her mask, but she quickly recovered. "Of course, darling. Rest up. We can handle business tomorrow." She thought she was being gracious to a fool, unaware she had just given the enemy 12 hours to prepare. As Alara closed her bedroom door, she didn't cry. She pulled a burner phone from her lining and texted her legal team. They took the bait. Initiate Phase 1. The house settled into a deceptive silence shortly after midnight. I waited in the darkness of my childhood bedroom, listening to the rhythmic creaking of the settling floorboards, a sound that used to comfort me, but now only signaled that the occupants were finally asleep. I wasn't just a daughter returning home anymore. I was a ghost in the machine, and it was time to haunt them. I slipped out of bed, dressed in black, and moved toward the panel in the back of my closet. It was a relic from the Prohibition era, a narrow service passage that bypassed the main hallway's motion sensors, leading directly to the library's false bookshelf. Lydia and Julian had lived here for years, treating the estate like a trophy, yet they never bothered to learn its secrets. I slid the panel open and stepped into the stale, dusty air of the crawlspace, moving silently toward the heart of their deception. Inside the study, the air was thick with the smell of Julian's pretentious cologne. I didn't waste time looking for paper files. Amateurs hide paper, but professionals hide data. I connected my portable drive to the desktop computer's rear port, bypassing the consumer-grade firewall Lydia had likely installed by the Geek Squad. It took less than 3 minutes to crack the local administrator password, Julian's birthday, predictably. I wasn't looking for the official books, the sanitized version they showed the IRS. I was hunting for the shadow ledger, the parallel accounting system that tracks illegal cash flows. Buried deep within a mislabeled system folder named Old Tax Returns. I found it. The screen illuminated the room with a pale blue glow as I scrolled through columns of devastation. The numbers were worse than I had imagined. They hadn't just dipped into the reserves, they had hollowed out the company from the inside. But the real gut punch came when I cross-referenced the withdrawals with the beneficiary accounts. My breath hitched in my throat as I saw my own name attached to a series of high-risk business loans totaling $4 million. They had forged a power of attorney document 3 years ago, effectively stealing my identity to leverage debt against assets I didn't even know I still owned. I was staring at financial ruin orchestrated by my own family, a calculated attempt to shackle me with their liabilities while they ran off with the cash. I continued digging, adrenaline sharpening my focus. The trail of money didn't stop at the loans. I traced the outgoing wire transfers to a series of shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland, all hidden under innocuous names like Azure Consulting and Alpine Logistics. The pattern was undeniable. Lydia was siphoning the company's operating profits into these offshore accounts, bleeding the business dry. The strategy was a classic bust-out scheme. She was preparing to file for corporate bankruptcy, which would leave the employees destitute and the creditors knocking on my door, while she retired to a villa in Zurich, funded by the stolen loot. Then I saw the file that made my blood run cold. It was a digital scan of a property transfer authorization signed by my father. The date was stamped just 2 days before he died, a time when he was comatose and intubated in the ICU. The signature was shaky, a grotesque imitation of his powerful hand. This wasn't just fraud anymore. It was elder abuse, perhaps even evidence of something more sinister regarding his final days. I needed verification, and I needed it outside these walls. I downloaded every byte of incriminating data onto my encrypted drive and slipped back through the passage, exiting the house before the sun could betray me. An hour later, I was sitting in a 24-hour diner, on the edge of the city, the neon lights buzzing overhead. Across from me sat Marcus, a former federal investigator turned forensic accountant who had been my mentor at the firm. I watched his face harden as he swiped through the tablet I handed him. He didn't speak for a long time, his eyes darting across the spreadsheets and the forged medical authorizations. "Alara, this is airtight," Marcus finally said, his voice low and grave. "The shell companies, the identity theft, the forgery, it's a RICO case wrapped in a bow. But you have a massive problem." He tapped the screen, highlighting a pending transaction I had missed in my haste. "These offshore accounts aren't just holding tanks. They are staging grounds. I'm seeing chatter on the wire that Vance Industries is in final talks for a merger with Omnicorp. If that deal closes, these shell companies will be dissolved and the data scrubbed. The liquidity will be washed into the conglomerate's massive revenue stream, and this paper trail will disappear forever." "When is the merger?" I asked, gripping my coffee cup until my knuckles turned white. Marcus looked at his watch and then back at the data. 48 hours, maybe less. They are rushing the closing." The realization hit me like a physical blow. If I didn't act immediately, they would get away with everything, and I would be left with millions in debt and a destroyed legacy. I grabbed the tablet back, scrolling frantically to the bottom of the pending folder to see what their next move was. My eyes landed on a final transfer order queued up and ready for authorization. The timestamp on the forged document wasn't just recent. It was dated for tomorrow. They were planning to sell her inheritance before the sun even came up. I walked into the breakfast room with the practiced shuffle of a broken woman, knowing that in less than an hour, Lydia and Julian intended to liquidate my legacy. They were already huddled over a fresh pot of coffee, their phones buzzing with the frenetic energy of a deal, closing the air thick with the scent of roasted beans and impending betrayal. I had to derail a moving train without them realizing I was the one switching the tracks. I poured myself a cup of tea, letting the china rattle slightly in the saucer to feign nervousness, and cleared my throat. "I've been thinking about the waiver," I said softly, causing them both to snap their heads toward me with predatory anticipation. "I'll sign it, of course. I feel bad that you're selling so low." Lydia froze her cup halfway to her lips. "What do you mean, low?" she asked, her voice sharp. I shrugged, looking down at my toast as if I had spoken out of turn. "Well, in the city, I have a friend, Arthur Thorne. He represents a private equity firm that specializes in heritage brands. He's been looking for a portfolio piece exactly like Vance Industries to add prestige to his fund. He usually pays 20% above market value just for the name." I paused, letting the number hang in the air like a lure. "But since you've already found a buyer for tomorrow, it doesn't matter." I just thought, well, 20% is a lot of millions to leave on the table. I watched the greed bloom in their eyes, overriding their caution almost instantly. Julian exchanged a glance with his mother, doing the mental math. 20% on a multi-million-dollar buyout was enough to buy a private island, or at least a fleet of the Italian sports cars he coveted. "Call him!" Julian commanded, trying to sound authoritative, but sounding merely desperate. Tell him he can meet us. We can stall the current buyers for 24 hours. Tell them we're running a final compliance check. They had taken the bait. By delaying the sale to chase a phantom premium, they had just bought me the one thing I desperately needed: time. While they scrambled to restage the house to impress my fictional investor, I retreated to the library, claiming I needed to draft the introduction email. In reality, I was engaging in digital warfare. I logged into the county clerk's portal, using my credentials, which they had foolishly never revoked, and began filing a series of lis pendens notices of pending legal action against the estate's primary land titles. These filings wouldn't show up immediately on a cursory search, but they would act as a digital tripwire the moment a bank or title company tried to transfer the deed, freezing the assets instantly. It was a silent, invisible cage dropping around the property. Next came the document itself. I drafted a preliminary exclusivity agreement, a standard-looking contract that ostensibly bound my investor to the deal. However, buried in Section 14, Paragraph B, amidst a wall of dense legalese regarding representations and warranties, I inserted a poison pill clause. It stipulated that if any current officer of the company was found to have engaged in fiduciary malfeasance or misrepresentation of assets, all executive voting power and equity would immediately revert to the original bloodline beneficiary to preserve the company's integrity. It was a death warrant disguised as a confidentiality agreement. I printed it on the heavy cream-colored bond paper my father used to favor giving it the weight of legitimacy. But legal traps weren't enough. I needed them fractured. I found Julian in the garage, aggressively polishing his vintage Porsche, preening over the money he thought he was about to make. I leaned against the doorframe, watching him with a look of manufactured concern. "You know, Julian," I said casually, "I was looking at some of Dad's old files to prep Mr. Thorne. I saw the structure for the Cayman accounts Lydia set up. It's strange. The retirement ledger seems to be solely in her name. Is that how you two split the equity 80-20? Julian stopped mid-wipe, his reflection in the car hood warping as his face tightened. "What? No, it's a 50-50 split. Always has been." I shrugged, walking away. I'm probably reading it wrong, but the withdrawals were significant. I left him there, the seed of paranoia rapidly taking root. I found Lydia 20 minutes later in the solarium arranging orchids with manic precision. "Julian seems stressed," I observed, picking at a dead leaf. "He mentioned something about restructuring the board after the sale. He thinks the new owners will want a younger vision for the CEO role. It sounded like he's planning to push for your retirement sooner than you thought." Lydia's grip on the shears tightened until her knuckles turned white. "He said that," she hissed. "After everything I've done to protect his inheritance." I nodded sympathetically. By dinner time, the silence between them was deafening. They weren't looking at me. They were glaring at each other, each wondering if the other was plotting a double cross. They were so busy guarding their backs from their partner that they completely forgot to watch the front door. That evening, I presented the exclusivity agreement to them in the study. I told them Mr. Thorne required it signed before he would board his jet, a guarantee that we wouldn't sell to anyone else while he was in the air. Julian, eager to prove he was the decision-maker in front of his mother, snatched the papers. He didn't even read the fine print. His eyes were glazed over with visions of wealth, and his mind was distracted by the suspicion I had planted about his mother's offshore accounts. He saw the title, saw the potential dollar signs, and uncapped his expensive fountain pen. Lydia, too, focused on outmaneuvering her son, simply followed his lead, desperate not to be left out of the transaction. Her brother handed her the pen with a smirk, thinking he had won, unaware that the document he just signed didn't grant him power. It admitted his guilt. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was transformed into a glittering cavern of gold leaf and crystal for the 50th anniversary of Vance Industries, a spectacle designed to dazzle the shareholders and distract the press from the rot eating away at the company's foundation. I stood in the shadows of the velvet curtains near the stage, clutching a sleek black clutch that held not lipstick or a compact, but a terabyte drive containing the forensic dismantling of my family's reputation. The air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the nervous sweat of board members who knew the quarterly numbers were a lie. From my vantage point, I watched Lydia and Julian working the room like seasoned politicians, clinking champagne glasses and laughing with the very people they intended to defraud. They looked radiant, flushed with the victory of the previous night, believing they had successfully secured a higher valuation for the company, while simultaneously sidelining me with what they thought was a meaningless waiver. They had no idea that the document they signed in the privacy of the study had already been digitally notarized and filed with the Securities Commission, turning their own signatures into a confession. The room was packed with the city's elite senators, hedge fund managers, and the entire board of directors for Omnicorp, the conglomerate acquiring our family business. A massive screen behind the stage cycled through a nostalgic slideshow of my father. His image projected 20 feet high, a silent ghost presiding over the looting of his life's work. It was grotesque. Lydia had orchestrated this entire evening as a victory lap, a final ego stroke before she cashed out and fled to Zurich. I smoothed the fabric of my dress, feeling the cold metal of my phone against my palm. I wasn't here to celebrate. I was here to execute the final phase of a plan that had been 5 years in the making. The wait was agonizing but necessary. I needed them to be at their absolute highest point of confidence before I pulled the floor out from under them. The lights dimmed and a hush fell over the crowd as a spotlight cut through the darkness, finding Lydia at the center of the stage. She looked every inch the grieving widow turned resilient matriarch, wearing diamonds that I knew were purchased with money siphoned from the employee pension fund. She approached the microphone with a practiced humility that made my stomach turn. "Thank you all for being here to honor my late husband's legacy," she began, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "It has been a difficult transition, but we have weathered the storm. Tonight we are not just looking back, we are looking forward to a new era of prosperity with our partners at Omnicorp." The applause was polite, dutiful. Then she made her mistake. She couldn't resist the urge to twist the knife one last time. She scanned the crowd, her eyes locking onto me in the wings. "And I am so touched that my stepdaughter Alara could join us tonight. After years of finding herself, she has returned to the fold. Alara, please stand up. Let everyone see that the Vance family is united." The spotlight swung to me blindingly bright. The room erupted in condescending applause. I could see the smirk playing on Julian's lips from the front row. They wanted me to be the prop, the wayward child bowing to their benevolence. It was the perfect setup. I didn't bow. Instead, I walked out of the shadows and ascended the stairs to the stage. Lydia's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she quickly recovered, stepping back to welcome me to the microphone, assuming I was coming to offer a tribute. I took the podium, the heavy silence of the room amplifying the sound of my breathing. "Thank you, Lydia," I said, my voice calm, steady, and amplified to every corner of the ballroom. "It is truly a night for transparency. Before we finalize the merger and sign the documents tonight, I think there is one question the shareholders deserve to have answered." Lydia stepped closer, her hiss barely audible off mic. "Alara, what are you doing? Sit down." I ignored her, turning to the confused representative from Omnicorp, seated at the head table. "Does the acquisition valuation include the assets currently held in the Azure consulting accounts in the Cayman Islands?" The room went deadly silent. The confusion on the faces of the board members was instant and genuine. Lydia's face drained of color, her composure cracking like cheap porcelain. "I don't know what you're talking about," she snapped, reaching for the microphone. "She's distraught. Cut the sound." But I was faster. I pulled the HDMI cable from the podium's laptop, which was running the slideshow, and plugged it directly into my phone. "I thought you might say that," I said, my thumb hovering over the cast button. So I prepared a different kind of presentation. The giant screen flickered to life, and the stepmother's confident smile vanished as she saw her own offshore bank account number projected in 4K resolution. The silence that followed the projection was heavy, the kind of suffocating pressure that precedes a natural disaster, sucking the oxygen right out of the ballroom. The numbers glowing on the screen behind me were not just digits. They were a roadmap of betrayal magnified to 20 feet high for the entire financial elite of New York to scrutinize. I didn't give Lydia time to recover from the shock of seeing her secret Swiss bank account number looming over her head like a guillotine blade. I stepped closer to the edge of the stage, my voice steady and commanding, shedding the skin of the fragile daughter to reveal the auditor underneath. "What you are looking at," I announced, gesturing to the complex web of transactions now cycling on the screen, "is a classic bust-out scheme executed with money that belongs to the pension fund of Vance Industries." I clicked a button on my phone and the slide changed to a timeline graphic. Here you see the systemic draining of operating capital into shell companies registered under Azure Consulting, and here, I pointed to a jagged, shaky signature displayed side by side with a hospital intubation log, is a transfer of deed authorized by my father, William Vance, 3 days after he slipped into a coma, unless my father learned to sign documents telepathically while on life support. This is forgery. The room erupted into a low murmur of outrage, the polite veneer of the gala shattering instantly. Lydia, her face a mask of crumbling plaster, lunged toward me, her manicured claws reaching for the microphone. "She's lying!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with desperation. "My stepdaughter has a history of mental instability. She's off her medication. Cut the feed. Security, get her off this stage." She looked frantically toward the back of the room, expecting the hotel security to drag me away, but nobody moved. I simply smiled, a cold, sharp expression that offered no mercy. "I don't think security is going to help you, Lydia, and neither is Mr. Thorne." I nodded toward the table where my investor, Arthur Thorne, had been quietly sipping water. He stood up slowly, reaching into his jacket, not for a checkbook but for a badge. "Arthur isn't a private equity investor," I revealed to the gasping crowd. "He is a senior forensic auditor with the Securities and Exchange Commission. And that exclusivity agreement you and Julian signed last night, it wasn't a business deal. It was a sworn affidavit confirming your roles as the sole officers responsible for these accounts. You didn't just sign a contract, you signed your confessions." The color drained from Julian's face so fast he looked like a corpse. He stared at the SEC agent, then at the screen, and finally at his mother. The paranoia I had planted in the garage, the seed that Lydia was stealing from him too, bloomed into full-blown panic. "You said it was safe," Julian shouted, his voice shrill and echoing in the stunned ballroom. He backed away from Lydia as if she were radioactive. "You told me the offshore accounts were for tax efficiency. You didn't tell me you were stealing the pension fund." Lydia whipped around, her eyes wide with fury. "Shut up, you idiot!" she hissed, but Julian was too terrified to stop. He turned to the crowd, hands raised in surrender. "I didn't know. It was her idea. She told me if I didn't sign the papers, Alara would come back and take everything. I was just following orders." The crowd watched in horrified fascination as the united front of the Vance family disintegrated into a cannibalistic frenzy. It was the perfect payoff to the psychological warfare I had waged. They were doing my work for me, publicly testifying to each other's guilt. From the side stage, Marcus stepped forward carrying a thick binder of physical evidence. He didn't look at the screaming family members. He walked straight to the terrified Omnicorp board members. "These are the verified bank records from the Cayman Clearinghouse," Marcus stated loudly enough to be heard over the commotion. "They confirm that $40 million was moved from company accounts to Lydia Sterling's private hold just 48 hours ago. The company you are about to buy is a hollow shell." The Omnicorp CEO stood up, buttoning his jacket with finality, and threw his napkin on the table. The deal was dead. Lydia watched the merger and her escape route evaporate. She turned to me, her eyes burning with hatred. "You ungrateful little brat!" she spat, lunging across the stage, but she never reached me. The double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open with a heavy thud, and a team of federal agents streamed in, their movements precise and practiced. They weren't there for crowd control, they were there for the targets Arthur Thorne had identified. The flash of cameras went wild, the press sensing the story of the decade as the agents ascended the stairs. Julian was sobbing now, offering his wrist to the officers before they even asked, babbling about a plea deal. Lydia, however, tried to maintain her dignity, straightening her spine even as an officer recited her rights. She looked at the handcuffs as if they were a fashion faux pas, but the metal clicked shut around her wrists all the same. The contrast was stark, the glittering diamonds on her fingers against the cold steel of justice. As they began to lead her away, I stepped forward to the table where the notary was still sitting, paralyzed by the scene. I picked up the pen, the same gold pen Lydia had tried to force on me the night I arrived, and reached for the contingency document I had prepared with my legal team. It was a court order triggered by the proof of fraud, which reinstated the original bloodline beneficiary as the sole trustee and CEO of Vance Industries to oversee the liquidation and restitution. I signed my name with a flourish, the ink dark and permanent. I was no longer the victim. I was the architect of their downfall. I walked over to where the officers had paused with Lydia. She looked small now, stripped of her power, her narrative, and her future. I moved into her personal space, smelling the fear beneath her expensive perfume. As the handcuffs clicked, Elara leaned in and whispered to her stepmother, "You were right about one thing, family really is everything." The weeks following the gala were a blur of flashbulbs, subpoenas, and the relentless grinding gears of the justice system, a chaotic symphony that sounded like victory to my ears. The immediate aftermath of the arrest wasn't quiet. It was a media firestorm that consumed the Sterling Vance legacy, burning away the rot to leave a clean slate. I spent my days in conference rooms with Arthur Thorne and a team of asset recovery specialists, methodically stripping Lydia and Julian of every layer of protection they had built with stolen money. It was a surgical dismantling of their lives. We obtained court orders to freeze the Swiss accounts before the ink on Lydia's booking sheet was even dry, repatriating millions of dollars that had been earmarked for her European retirement. The satisfaction wasn't in the numbers, though. It was in the tangible reclamation of the things they valued more than family. I watched from the gallery of the auction house as the government sold off Julian's beloved vintage Porsche and Lydia's collection of fur coats to pay back the creditors. The proceeds didn't go into my pocket. I directed every cent back into the Vance Industries pension fund, refilling the accounts of the loyal employees my stepmother had tried to rob. It was the ultimate insult to her greed, using her liquid assets to secure the futures of the people she viewed as peasants. The legal proceedings were swift and brutal. Confronted with the digital mountains of evidence Marcus and I had compiled, Julian's bravado evaporated. He took a plea deal almost immediately, testifying against his mother in exchange for a reduced sentence, a final act of cowardice that sealed his fate as a pariah. Lydia, however, fought until the bitter end, her narcissism refusing to let her admit defeat. The sentencing hearing was the first time I had seen her since the gala. She stood before the judge, stripped of her designer armor, looking older and smaller in the drab court-issued clothing. When the gavel came down, 15 years for fraud, embezzlement, and elder abuse, she didn't cry. She just stared at the back of Julian's head with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. The judge's words rang out clearly, dissolving the Sterling name into disgrace, effectively erasing the social cachet she had spent 30 years cultivating. A week before she was transferred to the federal penitentiary upstate, I went to visit her. The detention center was a stark contrast to the plush velvet of the Plaza Hotel, a world of gray concrete and fluorescent buzz. I sat on the metal stool on the visitor's side of the plexiglass partition, my hands folded calmly on the table. When the guard brought Lydia in, she looked haggard, her roots showing gray, her skin sallow without her regime of expensive treatments. She sat down slowly, picking up the phone receiver with a trembling hand. There was no defiance left in her eyes, only a hollow, bottomless resentment. "Are you here to gloat, Elara?" she rasped, her voice sounding like dry leaves. "To see the queen in her cage." "No, Lydia," I replied, my voice devoid of the anger that used to consume me. "I'm here to close the account." I reached into my purse and pulled out a small velvet pouch. I pressed it against the glass. Inside was the emerald engagement ring she had worn for decades, the ring that had belonged to my biological mother, which Lydia had claimed as her own the day she moved in. The authorities had seized it as part of the asset forfeiture, and I had bought it back at the auction that morning. "I'm taking back what belongs to the Vance bloodline," I said softly. "And as for you, I've arranged for a small deposit into your commissary account, enough for toothpaste and stamps. Consider it the final severance package." I didn't wait for her to scream or beg. I hung up the phone and walked away, the sound of her banging on the glass fading behind me like a bad dream. I didn't look back. There was nothing there worth seeing. The next morning I walked into the headquarters of Vance Industries not as the interloper but as the owner. The atmosphere in the building had shifted. The tension and fear that had permeated the hallways during Lydia's reign were gone, replaced by a tentative hope. I didn't waste time. I convened an all-hands meeting in the main atrium, standing on the balcony where my father used to address the troops. I announced the complete restoration of the pension fund and the immediate termination of the CFO and the board members who had been complicit in Lydia's scheme. In their place, I introduced Marcus as the new chief financial officer, a man whose integrity I trusted with my life. The applause that followed wasn't the polite, terrified clapping of the gala. It was genuine, a release of breath held for too long. I spent the rest of the afternoon in the executive suite purging the physical remnants of the occupation. I boxed up Lydia's gaudy art and Julian's trophies, ordering them to be donated or destroyed. The office felt larger, now breathable. I sat at my father's desk, running my hand over the mahogany surface, finally feeling the weight of the legacy settling squarely on my shoulders. It wasn't a burden anymore. It was an anchor grounding me. My phone buzzed on the desk, a call from a major tech firm in Silicon Valley, a potential partner who had heard about the clean sweep at Vance Industries and wanted to do business with an ethical leadership team. I smiled, realizing that by exposing the rot, I hadn't destroyed the company. I had saved it. The future was unwritten, and for the first time in 5 years, the pen was in my hand. I packed my laptop and stood up, the city skyline twinkling outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. The sun was beginning to crest over the horizon, painting the skyscrapers in hues of gold and fire. I took one last look at the empty boardroom table. The ghosts of the past finally exercised their chairs, empty, their voices silenced by the truth. There was no more hiding, no more pretending, no more games. She turned off the lights in the empty boardroom, leaving the past in the dark, and walked out into the blindingly bright morning sun. If you found satisfaction in seeing Alara reclaim her legacy and serve justice to those who tried to destroy her, then please make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another story of ultimate payback. I really want to hear your perspective in the comments section below, specifically regarding how Alara handled the final confrontation with her stepmother. Do you think she went too far by leaving Lydia with nothing but a few dollars for the commissary? Or was it the perfect punishment for someone who valued money over family? Let me know your honest opinion, and I will see you in the next video.